Should born-again Christians be evangelized? Do you, as a Christian, need to be evangelized? Do you need to hear the gospel constantly? All too often in our modern church, I think we fall into the trap of believing evangelism is solely for unbelievers, and that for our Christian walk, the gospel is not that important. We tend to put the gospel on the shelf after we come to Christ. Now, evangelism itself, of course, is the proclamation of the gospel, and certainly the world needs to hear the gospel, to hear that finished work of Christ on the cross, with that call to repent and believe. But let me ask you, do we Christians need to hear it? The Bible is very clear. It explicitly answers yes. When we look at the book of Romans, for example, when we turn to chapter 1, verse 14, we hear Paul's purpose for writing this great letter. And the apostle writes, "For my part, I am eager to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome." And that word there, to preach, is to evangelize. And then in verses 16 and 17, he sums up the purpose of this whole letter, the reason why he wants to tell them what he wants to tell them. And the apostle writes, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, 'But the righteous man shall live by faith.'" For you see, when Paul writes this epistle to the church in Rome, he's never been there before. It's one of the few churches he's never visited. And so he writes them as an introductory way, describing the most important thing about the Christian faith, and that's the gospel. And he's writing that to Christians. He wants to preach the gospel to Christians. Why? Because it is the power of God for salvation. Now, we sometimes in the evangelical church get rather sloppy in how we use that word salvation. Usually we talk about salvation and we think only about being born again. And obviously to be born again is a critically important thing. But the new birth and also the doctrine of justification, that notion that we are made right in God, are part of salvation. The Bible uses the word salvation in a very broad way. It is the whole picture, from God calling us from the very beginning of time to our entrance in heaven with a new body. And that's why Paul can write in Ephesians chapter 2, "Work out your salvation with fear and trembling." Has that passage ever troubled you? I mean, are we not saved by faith alone? How can he therefore say, "Work out your salvation"? Well, the problem is, we hear with our ears salvation as just the born-again experience. And he doesn't say there, "Work out your new birth" or "work out your justification." But he says, "Work out your salvation." That whole process, from the very beginning of time into going into heaven. But that working out of salvation, that becoming born again, that becoming justified, and that walk of faith throughout all our Christian life is by the gospel. And it is the gospel that's the power of God. It is the good news of what Christ has done that not only transforms unbelievers to believers, it also transforms believers into a holy walk. Do you need to be evangelized? Do you need to hear what Christ has done for you? The scriptures are very explicit. The answer is yes, because that is the very power of God, and it is sweet and good to hear, so that we may taste the kindness of the Lord. Brothers and sisters, yearn to hear and taste the gospel, because it is the very power of God. Amen.